The goal of doing a goal of this lesson is really just to get through the next couple of kings. There are some, not as significant events as the ones that we just talked about and the ones that are upcoming. So for the sake of time, we're going to do it this way. I'm obviously here if anybody has any questions. So yesterday we finished up talking about the civil war between Malchut Yehuda and Malchut Yisrael. And the last thing that we did was we talked about the fact that Amatzia starts this war against Yoash Melech Yisrael. We talked about two possible opinions as to why. Either, from a more peaceful perspective, he's trying to make an alliance. You get access to my port, I'll get access to your port. Or probably more likely, or just more consistent with the text, right, is that he was actually going to war against him. And we filled in kind of the blanks from Divrei Hayamim yesterday, in which Amatzia had originally hired 100,000 soldiers from Malchut Yisrael, and he sends them home at the request, or really at the command of the Navi. They're offended. They're offended, A, because just of pride, they were supposed to fight, and they were offended that they were sent home, and B, because they were supposed to make a lot of money off of the spoils of war. So instead, they take matters into their own hand, and they kind of pillage this city in Malchut Yehuda. They kill 3,000 people, and they take the spoils of war to kind of make up for the value of what they thought they were going to make by going to war. And then, as a result, Amatzia responds. He's angry at Malchut Yisrael. He responds by going to war, but it really doesn't go well with him. And basically what happens is they lose, right? Malchut Yehuda loses this war. So back up here, just to go over this in Pasuk Yud Bet Vayinagev Yehuda Livnei Yisrael. They lost, right? They lost the war. Vayanus Ish Lo Halo, and everybody ran away. V'yad Amatziahu Melech Yehuda Pasuk Yud Gimel. Ben Yehoash ben Achaziah Tafas Yehoash Melech Yisrael b'Beit Shemesh, and he was captured, right? Amatzia Melech Yehuda was captured by Yoash Melech Yisrael. According actually to most opinions, if you take a look at the Mitzudat David, which I don't have up here, but if you take a look for a second, hang on, I'll actually bring it up. So the Mitzudat David here a little bit later on in Pasuk Yud Tet, okay, I'll get to that Pasuk a little bit later, but the Mitzudat David says here, Ki Avshe Tafsu Yehoash, when Yoash captured him, meaning he captured him and he sent him really right back to rule over his kingdom. So he really goes back to rule in his kingdom. But yet Yoash does successfully take a whole nice bunch of valuable things from the Beit Hamikdash. It's obviously not great. What's interesting, obviously, is that Yoash is still listed as a good king, despite all of this. That's a discussion maybe for another time. And that's basically the end of Yoash's life. So if you take a look at, we are over here, Pasuk Ted Vav and Ted Zayin, V'yetzer divrei Yoash asag v'rator shenalchami Amatzia Melech Yehuda halom ktuvim al sefer divrei hayamim l'machai Yisrael. Right. So the rest of Yoash's life, all the rest of the details, as we've mentioned, can be found in Divrei Hayamim. Pasuk Ted Zayin, Vayishkav Yoash im avotav v'yikaver b'Shomron im Malchai Yisrael v'yimloch Yeravam beno tachtav. Right. So he dies, Yoash. It seems like, relatively soon-ish after this war. He is buried with the rest of Malchai Yisrael, and his son Yeravam II, ultimately becomes the new king of Malchut Yisrael. So on your sheets that I gave you here, right? So these are some of the things that you're going to want to include in here. So here you have your Malchai Yisrael over here. Here you have Yoash over here. So you're going to want to include that he goes to a civil war with Amatzia. You're going to want to include right over here, right, that he is the one who, let's see if I could actually add it, okay, went to war with Amatzia. Sorry that it's in English, just easier for now. He is the one who had this relationship with Elisha, and Elisha gives him this, Elisha and the arrows, the story of the arrows, if you remember. Right, he shoots out that arrow, and then Elisha tells him to keep shooting, and he ultimately stops. He could have defeated Aram eternally, but ultimately he only beats them for 3 battles. But he is overall a very successful king. Okay, overall successful king. Okay, obviously you don't have to write these things exactly, but I'm just, kind of summing up Yoash's life. Okay, so now back to Amatzia, because really they're kind of overlapping here. So if we go back to where we were, sorry to keep moving this thing. Hang on one second. Okay. Oh, I just lost my page. Okay, so we are here. So here we are up to Pasuk Yedzayin. Vayechi Amatzia ben Yoash ben Melech Yehuda acharei mot Yoash ben Yoachaz chamesh esrei shana. Sorry, I skipped a couple words. Right after Yoash dies, Amatzia lives for an additional 15 years. Right, you can see that kind of just the way that the chart falls out. Right, you see these are the additional 15 years that he lives after Yoash. But something interesting happens. Pasuk Yirchad v'yeter divrei Amatziyahu alom tivim. Okay, etc. I'm going to skip this. Here's what happens at the end of his life. Very sad ending to his life. Vayiksheru alav kesher b'Yerushalayim vayanas lachisha vayishlechu alav lachisha vayimitu sham. It seems like people from his own melucha, from Malchut Yehuda, are pretty angry with him. And we could talk about why in a second, right? And they basically, Kesher, if you remember from the previous, from a couple prakim ago, Kesher, it's a rebellion, right? Atalia says that. Basically his own people stage a rebellion against him in Yerushalayim, and he runs away, right? He runs away, he's scared for his life. He runs away to a place called Lachish, and ultimately, according to actually some of the midrashim, he lives in Lachish. He stays locked in this like fortress in Lachish for 15 years until ultimately they ultimately manage to break through and they kill him there. So he really lives the rest of his life in complete and total fear of being killed, which is probably punishment in and of itself for what he had done. What we talked about yesterday with the war, with killing the people in a cruel fashion, etc. So that is basically, the end of Amatziahu's life. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to go there. It's interesting how it says this, and then it talks about the rebellion. I could try and talk about why in a second. Vayisoto al susim vayikaver b'Yerushalayim imavotav v'ir David vayikchu kol ha'am et Azariah v'hu ben 16 shana vayamlicho oto tachat aviv Amatziahu. When Amatziahu was in Lachish for the remaining 15 years of his life, they needed a king, right? So they appoint his son. His son's name is Azariahu. He also becomes known. They ultimately change his name to Uziyahu. And if we go to our chart over here. Okay, so you have Amatzia, we talked about, right? There were definitely some good things about his life, right? He went to war successfully against Edom. Okay, he gains access to the port near Eilat. Basically, it was in the southern part. Okay, then for some of the reasons we talked about, he decides to go to war against Yoash, king of Yisrael, right, which we said was definitely a controversial decision. And he ultimately loses. He is captured and lives the remaining 15 years as king in hiding in Lachish. Okay, so again, these are just some of the things that you can put here. But if you look at this, the way that the chart is made here, right? You see here it says Melech Uziyahu 15 shanim b'chayei aviv, right? He was literally living the last 15 years of his life in hiding. So they appoint his son Uziyahu as the next king. So back to our text here. Okay, so so let's go on to this. Sorry. Okay, so here we go. He is 16 years old. So it was his father, it was Amatzia, who gains access to Eilat, but it is actually his son Uziyahu, or Azariah. We're going to call him Uziyahu because that's really how he's referred to. It is his son who actually builds up the city. After his father dies, it was really a continuation of his father's success. Okay, Pasuk Chav Gimel. B'shna chamesh esrei shana le'Amatziahu ben Yoash melech Yehuda. So when Amatzia was still officially in power, although his son is really the ruler, okay, Malach Yeravam ben Yoash melech Yisrael b'Shomron arba'im va'achat shana. So you have the next king of Malchut Yisrael, who is Yeravam, the son of Yoash, right, from the family of Yehu, right, who now becomes the king, and he rules for 41 years. Vayas hara b'nei Hashem lo sar mikol chatot Yeravam ben Nevat asher achti Yisrael. Generally speaking, he was bad. Now, what's interesting is that we're going to see a little bit of a different approach here, like really on Hashem's part, right? Until this point, what we've been, I think the trend that we've been understanding or that we've been seeing is that anytime a king is bad, usually they don't last too long, right? Hashem kind of starts to take a little bit of a different approach. Perhaps we could even say that really, Yeravam actually has a pretty successful tenure as king from like a political perspective, from an economic perspective, but not from a religious perspective. Whenever it says Vayas hara b'nei Hashem, that just means religiously he was not great, but he actually was a very successful king. He expanded the borders, etc. And it could be that Hashem is taking a little bit of a different approach, right? Until this point, every time that Bnei Yisrael have a bad king, Hashem sends an enemy to oppress them in the hopes that Bnei Yisrael are going to do tshuva. And ultimately, I guess at a certain point, Hashem realizes it's not working. This trend is not working, right? Not to humanize God so much, but just to put it, I guess, in terms that we could understand. And so he basically puts this guy Yeravam from the family of Yehu in charge, and he's extremely successful, hoping that by nature, by virtue of the fact that they're succeeding, maybe Bnei Israel will turn to God, and maybe they'll be thankful and they'll be willing to actually do tshuva. It's not exactly what happened. There's really almost no good kings left for the most part from this point forward. Pasuk Chaf, Hu heshiv et Kol Yisrael milavo chamar ad yama arava kidvar Hashem Elokei Yisrael asher diber b'yad avdo Yonah ben Amittai hanavi. Basically, he succeeds in expanding the borders. Specifically, he actually, if you look down here, he actually expands the borders that were made smaller by Aram. He recaptures a lot of the land from Aram that had been captured during the days of his predecessor. If you remember, Aram, even in the end of the days of Yehu, started to capture land from Malchut Yisrael, and we know that it started to happen. It was happening during the other kings as well. Okay, and but ultimately, again, he's not like maybe he's not the firmest in the world, but ultimately he does achieve a lot of success. Okay, v'yeter divrei Yeravam. I'm skipping a couple of things here. Sorry, I'm going to go to this Kaf Zayin. Hashem is not ready to destroy Malchut Yisrael. Right? This maybe gives an explanation as to why Yeravam was successful, even though he was wicked in the eyes of God. Right? And Hashem was just not ready to do it. He was not ready to wipe them out. Yeravam ben Yoash. He actually gives them salvation. They're actually successful here. Right? There's a lull. There's a quiet period now, militarily speaking. Aram is not attacking them. Edom is not attacking them. Ashur is going to be the up and coming empire. They're not there yet. So they actually achieve this relative period of like calm and peace. But again, religiously not necessarily so strong. Right, he basically, again, reconquers a lot of the land that had been taken by Aram. Right, they're written in Divrei Hayamim. Okay, so going back to our chart over here, so if we go, if we go to Yeravam here, so he was followed in the ways of Yeravam the first, I should say, okay, or Yeravam ben Nevat. Okay, he didn't necessarily follow in the ways of God, but Hashem basically takes a hands-off approach and doesn't send a nation to oppress them in the hopes that Bnei Yisrael will do tshuva. Okay, when things are going well, maybe it wasn't working when things were going badly. Maybe things will be better when it's going well. Okay, he is very successful in expanding the borders of Malchut Yisrael. Okay, he takes back the land. That Aram had conquered. Okay, that was actually pretty successful. That was good on his part. Okay, and that's basically it. That's basically the story with Yeravam. And if you remember, just to give everyone some perspective, if you remember, Yehu's punishment, right, for that was that he only was going to rule for 4 generations. His family was only going to rule. So you have Yehu, and then you have Yehoachaz, Yehoash, and Yeravam, which means that the next king, okay, is going to be really the last from the family. That's Zechariah over here. Then things get really dysfunctional. Malchut Yisrael. Okay, Zechariah ben Yeravam is going to be the next king. Again, he doesn't last very long. So that's basically the end of this Perek. We're going to go on to the next one.